Hello, everyone. Very excited to have everybody together today. Welcome to an exciting and enriching discussion, which is close and which is very important and critical for today's time, right? That's the need of the hour for any revenue organization. It does not matter what size and stage of the revenue organization that you are part of, but it has never been a more important time for us to go back and look at the drawing board and either create a revenue operations maturity model or for your company, or reevaluate how your maturity model should evolve in the current times. I'm your host, Ankit, and I manage enterprise sales at Nektar. My co-host today is Richard. Richard is the Senior Vice President of Sales and Customer Success Insight Partners. In the role, he works closely with insights companies, helping first-time founders evolve the GTM organizations and scale well-oiled machine. He views his role as equal parts coach, subject matter expert, confidant, and thought partner. He values diverse perspectives and is as likely to quote John Boyd or Peter Drucker as he does the most cutting-edge research when working with founders tackling a GTM challenge. Richard started his career in product roles at Microsoft and Microsoft Research Asia before transitioning to venture-backed startups. He's held leadership roles in solutions, partnerships, sales, and full P&L general management. I'm very excited to kind of see Richard or talk about Richard's career progression in general, but Richard, very excited to have you today.
Yeah, and after an introduction like that, I'm not sure I can follow that up. But Ankit, really excited to be here. And as you mentioned, I work at Insight Partners. And for folks that aren't familiar, Insight Partners is an investment private equity organization. As of December 31st, 2023, we have about $80 billion in regulatory assets under management. We've invested in more than 800 companies worldwide. We've seen over 55 IPOs, and our tenure, depth, breadth, and organization give us unique reach into the market. And we help executive teams access networks, customers, resources, data, and counsel. And our scale also provides a platform to win with both IPO activity and M&A. So excited to share all of that perspective with all the great folks that are joining us here today.
All right, awesome, and great to have you, Richard. And it's interesting to hear about Insight Partners, right? I'm sure a lot of startups would kind of look forward to being part of the startup ecosystem with Insight Partners and the value that you bring as a GTM leader there, right? Richard, before we get into, I think, more discussion, little heavy stuff on the entire revenue operations model, as I mentioned, right, I think I'm fascinated about your career journey, right? And I don't know if somebody can really think about what imbibing or kind of following your steps that you've taken. Would love to hear about your journey, what you've done, and how as you worked across different roles, how's your sort of sense changed about GTM revenue as an organization?
So I think, as you mentioned, right, I started as a product manager in sync and store infrastructure at Microsoft. So pretty much like the back end of how Office documents communicate with, at the time, on-premise SharePoint servers. So for like younger folks on the phone, that's back before the cloud. And that was fascinating time, very interesting. And as part of my work there, I had gotten exposure to Office 365, which was the cloud solution. And I got to interact more closely with the sales team. I was a product person, but I kind of understood the vision for where we were going. And based on where my office was, there was a sales office right next door. And if anybody on this phone's worked with salespeople, they know how to get revenue and make it happen. So I got tagged into a lot of conversations. And that was very early in my career. I transitioned away from Microsoft and I joined a startup that, like many folks do, an engineer I worked with at Microsoft had built this little mobile analytics company. This was around the time that the iPad was launching, so like 2012, 2013. And joined, and they were like, well, what do you want to do? I don't know. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a startup engineer. They're like, well, you're good at talking to people. Why don't you go do sales engineering? What's that? Built out and kind of defined sales engineering at that organization, built it out, scaled it. Ended up moving from the East Coast of the United States to the West Coast of the United States to open an office and kind of scale the business on the West Coast and in the rest of the world. Moved to another startup and ended up building out all of the pre-sales, post-sales, implementation, kind of all of that. And then reluctantly took over the sales team. So I transitioned from being just a director of kind of solution and partnership engineering to being the VP of sales for the company. Fantastic run, grew revenue a bunch, and then just really needed a break. It was quite the challenge. Moved over and took a sideways step to help a mentor of mine build a professional community for revenue operations leaders. So for folks who might be familiar, Modern Sales Pros is about 45,000 revenue operations leaders and data-driven sales leaders in a community. We took that and kind of morphed it from just like a community that did events into a real thriving business. And that's how I got connected with Insight Partners, doing the work that I do today. So that's kind of the journey. I think my appreciation for go-to-market just continues to evolve. I think coming from engineering and really engineering at an engineering company like Microsoft, moving and getting to interact with Microsoft salespeople, and then moving into venture-backed startups and getting exposure to all of that, I developed a fine appreciation for how difficult the art and the science of sales is, and how much it's moved. When I started at my first startup, I was learning software as a service sales, SaaS selling, from people who had sold on-premise enterprise client access licenses, right? In 2012, people didn't understand SaaS the way that we do 15 years later. So just to have been part of and seen that evolution, and we've gone from go-to-market technology that allowed us to just blast everybody, right? You could just email everybody under the sun, and then that ended up highly regulated. And then we saw it with digital advertising, right? I could target exactly you with digital ads, and we've seen the backlash with privacy around that. So I've seen kind of go-to-market evolve to a world where now not only do you have an immense number of amazing businesses that you could potentially buy, you also have a tightening kind of budget, more difficult sales environment to be in. So you got to be at the top of your game from an art perspective. You've actually got to be good at creating an environment where somebody wants to buy. And you also have to know your stuff. You have to know your product. You have to know your ecosystem. You have to know your space. So I think it's been an interesting evolution to be a part of. And for our webinar today, as we talk about it, I think revenue operations has served it's interesting to see the evolution of it in that time frame, but it does serve important connective tissue. I think of revenue operations as product management for the revenue engine. And so it should be a revenue accelerant first and foremost, and everything else kind of falls out of that. So that's just a little bit on the background. I think the role that I do at Insight is probably worth a second on that. I spend a lot of time working with companies that are either evolving from a very nascent go-to-market motion. Maybe it's a founder and a few folks, getting that to the point where it's repeatable and we can hire our first revenue leader, build our first revenue team. And I spend the majority of my time with companies that are under probably 40 million in recurring revenue. So as companies get larger and larger, there's other folks who have more specialty in that space. I do see across the entire ecosystem, but that's kind of the sweet spot, which is why I'm excited to talk about some of the common pitfalls that I see as well.
Right. No, very, very exciting. And then I think, as you said, right, I think the entire space has evolved a lot. I think the way organization typically saw revenue coming from sales, from software and sales, and then how do you do your outreach and then do $1 million on-premise sales versus now selling seats and licenses. I think the way that we've seen revenue growing or the way we have to accrue revenue, I think that has seen a major shift in I think last 10 to 15 years, right? So awesome, Richard. I'll probably kind of get started with some of the core topics for our conversation today, right? One thing that I think, as we were talking about, right, everybody's mind is looking at now. Everybody's seen the bull run, right? Everybody's seen the market being completely crazy. Sales, as people say, was easier, right? And revenue was clicking, but last 18 to 24 months, and as you call, right? So sort of like an ice age, so to say, right? It's been little tough for everybody, right? How being part of a VC firm, which and being working with a lot of startups and then more mature organizations, how do you think, what are the common trends we have seen people who are successful, organizations that have been successful versus people who can learn from these things, challenges and do better now?
I think and from a go-to-market standpoint, it's a funny thing to say, what's old is new again, The organizations that I see doing very well are anti-pattern matching all of the scale that we used to do, right? It used to be easy. I could blast 30,000 emails out. I'd get a 4% response rate that would convert into opportunities. Where I'm seeing organizations be successful is on much more either in-person experiences, maybe you think curated small meetup groups or dinners or topic relevant conversations that are in person. And this is kind of wild, but cold calling. It's something where, look, I can build the best AI BDR robot in the world, and there's going to be a lot of those that come, and there's some great technology out there today. If I call you, Ankit, I am a person. You're on the phone with another person. We can make a human-to-human connection. And the art of sales, right? I help you make an emotional decision. I help you understand the emotional impact of the solution, right? The science of sales is all the rational stuff, ROI and efficiency. So I think that it's kind of funny to see, because you hop on LinkedIn and it's like, oh, did BDRs, we're going to just have AI robots doing all this. And that maybe, but I do think that human to human connection and kind of following on from that, the companies that are doing it well are actually investing in developing that capability in their team. This isn't something that you can just kind of figure out and hope, send your AE to a dinner and hope that they can carry an executive conversation. It does require care and feeding. And it's a skill that we've lost in some ways because digital advertising was cheap. It was plentiful. There was a world where it was pretty easy. I launch a great website, I do some targeted campaigns, and I get good inbound flow. Or I can just do a ton of outbound digital, right? Email marketing blasts and things like that. And I think we're past that. There's too many solutions competing for the buyer's attention right now. And so we have to break through that noise with some human to human connection. I think that's one. And I think the second is, and I know we'll probably get into this a little bit later, is this understanding that maybe our organizations are actually over-tooled. If you look at the procurement management vendors, so if you look at Vendor is one, Tropic is another, if folks are familiar, you see these organizations and like, we're spending so much per salesperson, per marketing person to get diminishing results. We don't need more tools for our teams. We actually probably need fewer tools better adopted to drive efficiency. So those are kind of some of the trends that I'm seeing out there. But I'd be curious for our audience to just throw it in the chat. Anything in there surprising to anybody? Is anybody like, no, we're like cold calling would never work, or oh my gosh, we're cold calling? I'm always curious we got some great minds here. So just throw it in the chat. I'll keep my eye on that.
Yeah, I would love to hear from people what you have to say from the audience, and then we'll probably put in a couple of polls in between as well. I think as we were going through, I think the entire revenue model, and then especially with the current market situation that we have, right? I think when I was doing some research, I came across some very interesting stats that I would want to kind of bring up and then walk our audience through this, right? So what you've been seeing is like for Q4 23 results that came out, right? So I think almost 3/4 of the companies of S&P 500, almost 71% of the companies have actually reduced their EPS guidance, right? And this has been the lowest 10-year average, right? So I think people have reduced from a percentage perspective, right? So the number of companies that have reported a negative EPS guidance, I think that has what you're seeing is probably the highest number of companies in last 10 years, right? With that, very interestingly, we've also been looking at, as you talked about, I think the sales motion has changed, the process of reaching out has changed, right? And probably we have created multiple siloed environment within the organization. And I think from the entire revenue funnel, we have created these siloed teams, functions, which have grown big in size, obviously a necessary part of as you grow and scale the organization, but what also has led to is inefficiency in the entire process, right? And I like to bring up a poll here to our audience to see, hey, when we look at revenue leakage, while organizations are looking at sort of a negative guidance, there's a lot of money that is being left on table, right? I think there is, because of inefficiencies, process gaps, siloed environment, right? Do you have any thoughts? I would like to kind of get your thoughts in terms of how much money are we leaking every year, right? Probably keep the poll open for a minute. Would love to kind of get your thoughts. All right, so I think looks like we have some poll results. We see almost 50% of the poll says more than 20%, which is actually correct, right? So we have this according to BCG report, and then Richard, I don't know if it's any shock to you, but looks like almost 25%, almost a quarter of our revenue, we are leaving out on the table, right? And then that I think brings to the whole idea of having a centralized team which could look at end-to-end the entire revenue funnel, look at what needs to happen and how do we bring it all together. Richard, any thoughts before we move forward?
Yeah, and I think that this is I trust the team at BCG. There's some very smart minds over there doing research. This actually might feel a little bit low to me when I think of how siloed these organizations become.
Right. And then, and I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, right, I think there's never been a better time for organization to invest in RevOps and go back and look at drawing board in terms of how they should look at RevOps as a function, because according to the data presented by Gartner, right, I think almost 75% of the companies by end of next year would invest in RevOps, right? So they would look at organizations are going to look at how they can invest, scale, deploy, be more efficient with the RevOps function if they've not already done so. And almost 3 out of 4 companies are going to do that by end of 2025. So which is great if you're in RevOps function, practitioner, RevOps consulting, RevOps technology, tools, software, right? So I think that's probably looks like some great times are coming ahead for us, right? But at the same time, very interesting fact is that almost 2/3 of the companies are likely to fail in their revenue operations process, right? And probably will go back to siloed environment because they tried something, did not really succeed in doing that. And then I think because everybody is trying to sort of put a definition of RevOps in their own way, right? And rather than following a process, a model that is scalable, efficient, and then could kind of look at future aspects of the organizations as well. This is where probably our focus for today's discussion is like to be, Richard, is that how would you suggest what kind of frameworks organizations should follow in RevOps, right? Where should they start? How do they kind of grow? What are the key elements that you would like to suggest?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question, and folks, feel free to ask questions in the chat here and challenge. I've got one perspective on this that's very refined from a lot of the work I do, but it's by no means gospel. To Ankit, to your point, RevOps is going to mean different things at different companies, and it's going to mean different things for different organizations at different scales. What's important with this, regardless of scale, size, or shape, is for it to be kind of chartered and clear about what it is and what it isn't. I think RevOps organizationally, big and small, it can get caught up in a lot of different things, and having some form of model of this is where we are today. This is where we hope to go in the future. This is what, this is what we want to do next can help. Hold on one sec. Just trying to cancel that. Share. Ankit, did we put my slides up in the live storm here?
I think so. With me.
If not, I swear, folks, I've got a good visual on this that helps make it very real. Just give us 1 second. There we go. Oh, there they are. Perfect. So when I think of RevOps, and folks, can everybody see this? Somebody, if we're sharing a slide. If somebody can't see it, please raise your hand or say something in the chat.
We can see the chat.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So when I think of the evolution of revenue operations, this is not just as a leader of revenue operations, but it's kind of like what the function does, what's going on at different stages. Out of the gate, revenue operations functions in a primarily administrative capability. This is just literally, I'm kind of keeping the lights on. I'm defining and reporting on the business. I'm like just kind of keeping things going. Organizations at this scale typically are searching for or in the process of deepening product market fit. So this will be your early revenue companies, think under 3, 4, 5 million. Here, you don't have enough people. You don't have a clear understanding of what's going on and what the actual final business will be like, but you need to kind of do something. You need to do some reporting on this. And if you don't staff and scale up correctly, organizationally, you may just end up being administrative. And this is as much the legacy of how we got to RevOps as it is where some organizations are today on maturity, right? This is an evolution of RevOps from just sales ops, which is kind of like reporting and CRM hygiene.
Right.
The next tranche that you kind of see organizations get to is this idea of an analyst, or RevOps being an analyst on the business. So you're driving insights, you're helping drive cross-functional alignment, you're really helping the business understand what's going on and look for opportunity to kind of optimize the business as it exists today. The goal state, and this is where RevOps has to head as a discipline, and for the RevOps leaders on the phone, this is your North Star, is this idea of advisor. That's where you're a business partner to the functional executives that you support, the CRO, the CEO, the CFO, CMO. You're in the business of trying to transform the business. Technology is a means to an end, not an end into itself. You're looking beyond just, we're going to get way better at what we're doing today. You're looking at and identifying, is there an M&A activity that we can take, a company out there that we could buy? Is there a new market that we should enter into? And how should we think about that? How could we potentially overcome regulatory challenges of doing business in X, Y, or Z country? And how would we stack rank going across those? So that, when I think of kind of a quick way to understand where you're at in the journey, this is a really high level framework. And it works for both your organization and for an individual RevOps leader, where just remember your push, and I love that line, business first, technocrat second, right? RevOps, and I see this forgotten all the time.
Right.
It's in the name, revenue. That's your role. Make revenue happen and help make it easier for revenue to happen. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about kind of where you fall on this continuum.
I think this is a really great framework for organization to get started, right? I think at this point we'll probably just pull in a quick poll just to see from our audience perspective, where do they sort of fit in their own sort of RevOps journey. People could just pull in where they are. Right. I think we're pretty I think we have quite a few votes in. Almost, I think we have more than half of our audience talking about they're still developing or sort of developing their maturity model or RevOps model. About 1/3 looking at sort of just getting started, and about 10% plus a little more mature stage of RevOps, right? Now, for this kind of audience, right, and then as people are scaling and starting, and some of the folks who are already in a little more mature state, how do you see that strategic alignment should happen between different functions, right? How do you kind of bring in more strategic element, and how do you kind of see that I think admin is great. I think sort of keeping the lights on is a great first step, right? But how do you kind of, as I look at revenue operations and strategic function, supporting the CE and the CXOs eventually, right? Is there a roadmap that they should look at? How to kind of, what's the maturity that the team can aim for?
I want to address the first part of the question of like, how do you foster kind of better cross-functional alignment? It actually starts with the CEO and the culture that the CEO is building.
Right.
And it kind of ends with who and how you hire. I see a lot of RevOps leaders struggle with this. There is a limit to how much alignment that you can affect in an organization that desires a lack of alignment. Right? There's some CEOs that don't understand the need to have sales, marketing, and kind of customer success and product and kind of all of your functions aligned. To the point on what can we do to kind of make that easier? What can we do to make that more difficult? It starts with being an aligner and pulling folks together and looking at and elevating the view of the business from the different silos of sales, marketing, customer success, product, whatever it might be, elevating the view beyond that. And if we go forward one slide, I think this is a good frame of reference for this, where if you think of kind of what operations is doing to deliver strategic value, and if we start at 6 o'clock, right? So we start systems, systems give us really good data. That data gives us great insights. That insight should inform strategy. The strategy that we set as an organization informs planning. The planning and what we hope to execute should achieve, should refine, and the process should reflect that. The process then should drive the systems that we need, which generate the data, which drive the insights forward. So it's kind of a circle. And if I think of where RevOps can start, it's really on that left-hand side of data, right? RevOps, for better or worse, you start out owning the CRM, right? I mean, it's a very common place for RevOps to start. That data is useful, but like as a former sales leader, I didn't spend time wondering what I could learn from Salesforce. I didn't spend time understanding, does a particular Pardot campaign that was run or something that we were doing from marketing, like how is that impacting it? Unless I heard it from the reps, right? I'm not looking at this data to draw insights, maybe reactively.
Right.
As a first step that you can take is in that data, really think of, I've got this data. What are the insights that could be interesting for the revenue organization, not sales, not marketing, not customer success? And from there, what do I think the marketing leader needs to know or could do? What do I think the sales leader needs to know or could do? What do I think that the CS leader could know or could do? A good way to look at this for folks, and I'll get tactical here for a second. I am a big fan, and I'm a big fan of understanding what is the NRR and GRR, so the net revenue retention and the gross revenue retention. How is that actually split out by the rep that closed the deal? There's very interesting insights that you can draw for a sales leader. If we say Ankit, he always closes the biggest deals, but those deals, we really struggle to expand them. I may have a training opportunity for Ankit around right sizing the deal. That's valuable insight for me as Ankit's coach and leader. Same thing, if I see a particularly high renewal rate or an early expansion rate with a particular CSM, well, that's awesome. What is that person doing? What is he or she doing? So those sorts of insights I think we take for granted as technologists, but they don't matter if they're not delivered appropriately to the business folks. So how do we drive alignment right? Starts with the CEO setting a culture of this is a revenue team, ends with who you hire, right? Those two pieces are tough to change, but then it's you as the revenue operations leader, especially in these developing worlds, looking at the data and coming up with insights and making it easy for them to make the right moves. Over time that evolves, but that's a good first couple steps to take to start to get some alignment between sales, marketing, customer success, and the other disciplines.
I think very interesting. And I think, as you mentioned, right, I think going back into that feedback loop, understanding what is working, not working, and how to kind of scale things that's working for us, and then kind of looking at how do we resolve the issues that were there. I think alignment is something that I think, as I said, right, so death, taxes, and conflict between sales, marketing, customer success is never ending, right? It's inevitable, right?
Well,
but we still.
Yeah, and I think another point on this too, Ankit, like back to your efficiency point, like is there anyone on this call who hasn't heard about the idea of like revenue efficiency, sales efficiency, marketing efficiency, engineering efficiency? That's the name of the game. And if you think we're living in a rule of, 40 or rule of 55 world, our leaders of sales, marketing, and customer success, it's actually a strategic imperative for them to think like business people and not think like I run sales, I run marketing, I run customer success, right? We're like way past the era where you can sit in a board meeting and go, well, marketing generated all these leads, and sales goes, well, they're all crap, but my team did a bunch of good work. And then sales closes the deals, right? Just think of that board meeting. Sales closes a bunch, and customer success is like, oh my gosh, those were the worst customers, but we did unnatural acts to retain. Like that, we can't run that org anymore. It doesn't exist. Right. And so these leaders need to up-level themselves, and revenue operations has a role to play in that, right? And helping them see these insights and understand the interconnectedness of the different elements of the business. Sorry to cut you off there, Ankit. I think it's an important point for our audience to kind of wrap their heads around.
No, I completely agree. And I think as soon as we start looking at breaking down those silos between different teams and then not looking at, hey, I just passed on the baton and this is where my role ends, I think the sooner we do that, I think the faster we can grow our revenue and then be a more cohesive force together. Right? Yeah. So great. I think I hope we're able to go back and talk to our leaders, respective leaders, and say, hey, and let's go back and change some of the things that you've done in the past and then see what we can do together for future. But now, let's say we've brought in all of this alignment. We're looking at a common goal. How do you define growth levers for an organization to look at, right? And what kind of KPI they should probably look at and measure to see they're moving in the right direction, right? And moving as a joint force together.
This is there's a lot here, right? If you were to unpack, like, let's say rule of 40, there's probably 85 different sets of precursors that you could look at. I'm gonna flip your question on its ear a little bit, and kind of hit on. Let me just fast forward through here, right? When we think of kind of revenue operations, your role in this idea of planning and kind of KPI development is to help answer two fundamental questions: how much and how. And it's how much do we need from X, Y, or Z, and how are we going to do it, right? We got to make sure those questions get answered. Right. And when we think of the operating plan, these are your major levers, right? We've got people, we've got products, price, market, distribution mechanism, and acquisition. And even for our lower maturity or developing RevOps maturity organizations, this might be very simple for you. This might be, we've got one product and that's kind of it, and we sell in one market. But this framework is still applicable. Because to grow, you need to answer a question. Well, how are you going to do it? Are we just going to keep doing exactly what we did? Or are we going to increase the average sales price and all that? So when I think of how to understand this, you need to recognize that there's some inherent complexity in the business. And I'd like kind of everybody just to grab a scratch pad of paper and think through, right? How many products do you have? How many segments do you sell to? How many markets do you sell? And what your distribution is. So just kind of take a minute, count up. We have 3 products, 2 markets, 1 segment, whatever it might be. And once you've had a chance to do that, multiply that number up. And that's the complexity of your business. And that complexity is going to shape how easy or difficult it is for you to affect change. That complexity is going to affect how you think about which growth levers to pull. And it's also going to affect which metrics to track and which KPIs to track to see if you're trending on pace or if you're trending kind of away from pace. And I'm curious if anybody, I'd love to just throw it in the chat if you went through the exercise. I'd love to get a sense of how many products, segments, markets, and distribution mechanisms. Multiply all that out and just throw the number in the chat. See if anybody does it. no takers. It's okay. I think that the other thing, there's some tried and true metrics that organizations should look at as they go through and they're scaling. I think for very early stage organizations like those that may be in the developing world, that I would be looking at things like win rate, new and expansion bookings growth, some metric of customer satisfaction. I think a lot of folks use Net Promoter Score, but you can use CSAT. The overall gross revenue retention, and then what does pipeline coverage look like? I think that those in the early stage kind of control for a lot of things. Mm-hmm. As an organization scales, looking at customer acquisition cost, CAC, CAC payback period, net revenue retention, bookings mix, right? How much is new versus expansion? And also starting to think about the rule of X, whether you want to be a rule of 40 company, a rule of 50 company, whatever it might be. And as an organization scales, really starting to think about sales and marketing as sales and marketing expense as a % of revenue, looking at overall quota attainment, SaaS quick ratio, and really starting to affect organizational change based on the rule of X that you're looking at. All of these, and we've got a number of insights around these metrics. So Pranay, I don't think I can drop it in the chat, but there's an entire blog series we have at Insight for folks that want to go way deep on this. Let me just see if I can actually drop it in here. Oh, I can. All right, look at that. There we go. For folks that want to take a peek, this gives you a sense of some of the KPIs to kind of look at stage by stage, in addition to some research on what benchmarks look like. So it's a good way for an organization to understand not only what are the macro metrics I need to be tracking for my business, but also how do I compare to others in the space? Caveat being, the benchmarks come from Insight portfolio companies, which is not representative of every company potentially under the sun, but it does give you directionally a good spot to start.
I think this is very, very helpful, right? I think it gives a perspective of, as we start looking at revenue, right? I think it's not like a linear model. I think there are multiple sort of permutation, combination, and you have multiple growth levers as a RevOps leader or as a revenue leader that you should sort of start thinking about, right? And as you scale, right, you need to understand, as you mentioned, right? So how much will we get from an NRR, right? How do we kind of scale our NRR? How do we kind of look at our GRR? How do we improve our win rate? How do we kind of look at probably shorten my sales cycle, right? And I think, and then that's where we've lot of also seen, I think going back to your earlier point was, I think one of the general challenges that we've seen a lot of RevOps leaders or generally ops leaders struggle with is kind of get to the truth, right? Get to sort of what everybody talks about single source of truth, but kind of how to kind of make sure that everybody in the organization is looking at sort of one single data point, some sort of coming to that sort of scenario where the misalignment sometimes also happens because you're looking at different metrics, right? You are looking at a different sort of source of truth, right? It reminds me of that blind man and the elephant story, right? So that CS is looking at very different function, looking at very different data sources, right? How do I kind of bring in that alignment in the organization?
Yeah, and I think it's a tricky problem, and I've got we can spend a lot of time on talking about developing a data dictionary. Where I see organizations fail is they let perfection be the enemy of good. Mm-hmm. So if we think of why we do reporting, right? Reporting is to drive visibility to an area or a set of areas of the business. The goal of driving that visibility is to drive action. Mm-hmm. And so if we look at that visibility, if we're creating reports, and I see this all the time when I work with a company, they'll say, "Oh, we've got all these reports." It's like, awesome. Is anybody looking at them? No. That's RevOps being a technologist, not RevOps being a business person. For RevOps leaders on the phone, even in the emerging organizations, the way that you solve for Ankit's problems is you actually sit down with your CS leader and go, how do you think of your book of business? What are the things that you're looking at every day? What are the things that you want to see happen? And how are you measuring that? And then you sit down with your sales leader and your marketing leader. You own defining the data strategy that will support that, and the collection and capture mechanism for it. That then gives you the ability to create visibility. But if that visibility doesn't drive accountability or action, you're kind of doing reporting for reporting's sake. So that's the approach that I see organizations take to do it well, instead of just having like a bunch of reports that nobody looks at. Yeah. The other thing with this, and there's always a question about, well, I need to capture more data. I would argue you probably don't, right? Think of a tension. There's this tension that you have between the information that you must have and need to run the business for those functional leaders and what a rep will actually put into the system, or what a marketing person or a customer success manager will put into the system. And that tension needs to err on the side of, we want the most complete data set as quickly as possible. Right. The more that you subject a rep to putting things in the system, the less likely you are to get it. That's where tools like Nektar can actually come in and play a very important role. But really being intentional about every time you're asking an account manager, a customer success manager, a product marketer, a salesperson to do something in the system, that's a minute, that's 5 minutes, that's 10 minutes that they're spent not doing the thing. They're not out there selling. They're not out there working with a customer to set them up to be successful. So just kind of recapping on this, because we touched on a lot, right? The reason we do reporting is to drive visibility to some part of the business. That visibility is done to drive accountability, and that accountability drives action. If we're presenting visibility and no one's taking action on it, that means no one's accountable. That means either it's the wrong stuff that we're looking at, or there's a missing gap. Somebody doesn't understand that it's their problem to solve. So again, index towards spending time with your functional leaders, figuring out the reporting that they need and putting them in a position where they can get it, versus having some argument about how many customers do we have, which would be a crazy and extreme example, but like I've seen it.
Right. Fair enough. I think it all depends on what kind of goals that you're trying to achieve, right? And I think what the problem that we're trying to solve. And going back to the whole idea of being aligned to, like, all teams being aligned and being aligned to the leadership, right? We've seen one question from the audience in terms of, I think we've talked about revenue operations as a setup. The question is more about like what percentage of RevOps is strategy versus execution, right? So what is the hat that a RevOps leader should kind of put on, and like how often do you change that hat?
Yeah, it depends. It depends a little bit on kind of stage of company, right? I think early stage, it's 100% of both, because there's just not enough people to do everything. What happens as an organization scales, and I think we'll get into this in a minute, but Prachi, it's a great question. What happens as an organization scales, you start to see revenue operations highest and best use be more of the operational executional pieces. So if we pop back, and I kind of went through this quickly, if we look at kind of this chart, revenue operations at a very large organization ends up owning maybe some of the pieces on the bottom of this, right? Strategy becomes part of a strategy office. Planning becomes part of the finance organization, right? Systems becomes part of information technology. And so RevOps is in kind of the processy zone, and it ends up being more executional. That's not to say it's not transformative work, but you're doing less to affect the capital S strategy of everything that we're doing in a business. You're contributing to it, but you're no longer the owner of it, because there's others whose highest, best use and full-time job it is to think about strategy.
Fair enough. Prachi, in case you have any follow-up questions, happy to take it up or move forward here. I think we spoke about the growth levers. We talked about, I think, the importance of alignment in terms of strategy, plus, I think, make sure that we look at shared goals. But how do we kind of set up like a RevOps function, right? So what are the key elements from like an organizational setup perspective? Does it need to report to, who should it report to, and what kind of function that we should look at, right?
I think it kind of comes back to almost answering this math helps you start to answer what it should look like. Because revenue operations, and this is it. If we kind of abstract some of what we've talked about today, here are some of the sample services that RevOps may provide to an organization, right? There's a strategy and planning component. right? It's the operating plan, it's headcount, territories, quota. There's data and analytics, right? This is the board level reporting. This is the functional reporting. This is the go-to-market reporting, the visualization, the management. There's systems and processes, right? Which is the tech stack, understanding what the process should be, understanding how we're going to manage the vendors in that tech stack, almost acting like the program manager for the technology of the revenue team, right? There's support and enablement. And this is the both the training aspect of it. So think skills, product training, sales methodology. It's also the supporting things like quote to cash, deal desk, making sure that there's the right infrastructure in place for lead management. And like all of those things are roles and opportunities and businesses that RevOps could be running. Mm-hmm. But if you get into something like quota setting and compensation, once an organization scales, there may be an entire team of folks in finance and HR and legal that are focused on the compensation philosophy of the business. It's no longer revenue operations' highest and best use to be the sole arbiter of how they design comp and quota. And so what you see as an organization scales, sometimes, and if we look at this, all right, we've got kind of the RevOps leader at the top, we've got those different services on the left. Sometimes it makes sense for the support of all of those functions to roll directly up to one central revenue operations leader, right? Mm-hmm. There's the most leverage to be gained for the organization, centralizing all of that under one leader. In other instances, it may make sense to decentralize pieces of it, right? Maybe, and I love comp and quota, right? Comp and quota, like there's a team that could focus on that. Territory design, there could be a team focused on that. How we think about strategic M&A.
Right.
There could be an entire strategy organization focused just on that. And so the role and how revenue operations evolves in an organization is a function of who else gets hired in. And for a RevOps leader, like I want to be really clear if it hasn't come across. If you think that your path to success is, I'm going to continue to hire, and I'm going to have a bunch of people working for me, and that's how I'm going to get to be the highest level RevOps leader, you are not thinking about this the right way. Right. You need to think of the space where you can generate the most efficiency with the resources you've got and what makes sense to hand off. Mm-hmm. Quota management is a pain in the butt. When you start to multiply, I mean, you're laughing, right? But you've been through there, even at an early stage company, setting an accurate and fair quota that allows you to run a responsible business is tricky. Right. Now think of it as a company that's got, back to our complexity calculation, think of it as a company that's got 50 segments, 7 different go-to-market mechanisms, and they're operating in 100 countries, each with their own unique labor laws. As a RevOps leader, do you want to wake up in the morning and tackle that? I mean, maybe, but like probably not. And so that's why I want folks on this call. Hopefully, it's kind of come across here, right? It's a higher order thinking of how can I bring the biggest business value to my functional leaders. And at a scaling organization, it might not actually be designing the perfect comp plan. Right. It might be making sure that the go-to-market systems are optimized and fully adopted. Mm-hmm. So that was a very long answer, Ankit, to your question around like, what's the org structure kind of look like? Here's the way to think about it. What I will say is there's some common paths that we see. So if we think of that kind of early stage operations organization, that early stage operations organization has, it's usually somebody who's kind of a director level, jack of all trades, can do a bunch of stuff, kind of like a generalist who can do everything reasonably okay, and maybe one more junior kind of systems expert, right? Typically, it's going to be most likely your CRM administrator. Mm-hmm. As the organization scales, and again, before we've gotten to this kind of fully matrixed, like we're a large organization, you start to see that director level skew more senior, maybe it's senior director or VP level. You've got an analyst or a few analyst folks that can help kind of take the data and turn it into insights. You've got somebody doing systems, maybe somebody also helping out on the enablement front, right? That's kind of the common RevOps org we see it, that's sort of the mid stage. At later stage, it ends up being mixed, right? You see kind of a team of teams. Those teams are comprised, it's a director, an analyst, kind of functional experts and all of that. But what those teams are doing, right? Is it support? Is it enablement? Is it core operations? Is it planning and insight? Depends a little bit on how the rest of the org has shaped out and what other capable leaders have been brought in.
I think this is definitely helpful, right? I think it also goes back to the point as a RevOps leader, when you're setting up your org, do you want to, I think, take everything on your plate and then you said, right? So I think wake up every morning with with some fire in some part of the organization, some part of I think is always kind of at risk, right? And then when do you kind of scale? How do you kind of decentralize or setting up a centralized? I think that's where I think going back to the whole idea of it's they will like setting up a RevOps team or it's not a linear function, it's not a one size fits all, right? So that brings to one question. Sorry, Richard, you were saying something.
Yeah, no. And I think it's an important call. And there's some organizations where maybe, and I've seen this at large publicly traded companies, there's 1,000 people underneath the RevOps leader, and they comprise kind of everything that we've talked about. There's other organizations that are very large, publicly traded organizations that have comparably teeny tiny revenue operations organizations. Neither of those are correct or incorrect, but it's built to suit the needs of the business. Back to what I said at the very beginning in the intro, you're kind of this organization is the product management function for the revenue engine.
Right.
The best product managers don't build every single feature from scratch. They use things that are publicly available. They use existing UI tropes. It's the same thing in terms of centralization and decentralization here.
Right. And then some of them attend sessions like these and learn some and get some tribal knowledge that's out there.
Exactly. And it's there's a small enough group of us, right? It's not like RevOps has been around for 200 years, right? This is a 15-year-old discipline. So we're in the early innings of figuring out a lot of these pieces in project. It's funny that you asked that question. How can RevOps measure their ROI? If you've got a really good answer for that, let me know. Because it's very, very tricky to look at. It depends on what you're doing from a revenue operations standpoint, right? If I'm leaning heavily into enablement, I think I can measure the effectiveness of that enablement, right? There's a lot of methods for that. If I'm doing a lot of the sales support work, so think like cash to quote, deal desk, territory design, I can look at certain things like for territories, have I designed equally economically viable territories? Have I set the reps up so they've got the tools that they need to get to a certain level of attainment, right? Systems, are my systems interoperating? Are they fully utilized? Well, things like that. I think the whole discipline, it's almost like kind of how do you measure the ROI of a parent, right? Like, I don't know what the ROI of my mom is. It'd be really tough to measure. It's valuable, but it's really, really difficult to put your finger on. And I know that's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but it's something we've spent a lot of time at Insight. I spent a lot of time even at Modern Sales Pros just talking about like, how do we measure the ROI of this thing? And it's very, very difficult to track.
Okay. No, I think, and it's a very, very pertinent question, right? Big question, because I think as organization look to invest, and then I'm still going back to, I think, a couple of points that we picked up from Gartner, right? So if that's the 70% of the organizations are going to invest, have already invested or are going to set up a RevOps function, somebody is going to ask this question, right? Why have we onboarded a number of people under this organization? How have we why did we restructure our processes? Why did we buy a bunch of tools to support this org, right? At the end, like finance is going to ask this question, right? What's the ROI? Right? So I think,
and I think it's one of those ones too. It also comes back to the charter, right? Are those organizations going to fail at RevOps because they did a bad job in executing, or did they do a bad job in planning? Yeah. I can't speak to all of them, but I would wager a guess that many of them didn't actually think through, why do we have revenue leakage?
Right.
What are the short, medium, and long-term things that we can do to address that revenue leakage? If we were to stand up a new organization to do it, what are the things that we would need that organization to do? What would the short, medium, and long-term metrics that I would look at? Like the process of thinking this through for an organization at scale, because that's what we're talking about here, Ankit. Those large organizations are thinking like this, right? What's the matrix of stuff? Why isn't it getting done? Whose highest and best use could we bring to it? I don't know how many are just going to snap and say, hey, we got to do this RevOps thing. It's supposed to make revenue versus go through the deliberate process to make it happen. And I would tell you, I don't guarantee it would, it might still fail if you went through this type of thinking, but it would certainly help you understand where to put your investment from people, from process, or from technology.
Right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense, Richard. And I think, while I think you briefly touched upon, but in case as a RevOps leader, I can lean on to the tribal knowledge and then experience of others, right? What are the common pitfalls, challenges that typically RevOps leaders face? Are there everybody goes through their own journey, but and obviously everybody makes their own mistakes. But is there anything that I can do to preempt that and then sort of avoid a few things?
A few things. I think RevOps is often penalized for its effectiveness. So if you're very, very good at RevOps, a lot of work is going to find your way to your plate. And if you're not, and back to my product manager analogy, if you don't have kind of a roadmap that you've shared and communicated with the organization about the current state, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, just like a product manager would maintain a roadmap for their function, you don't have any mechanism to effectively push back on work that comes your way. And you very quickly end up stuck in that kind of admin zone. You become a ticket taker, right? A task comes in, you execute that task. So I see organizations, I see RevOps leaders fail because they don't actually have that vision of short, medium, long term. This is where we hope to be. Mm-hmm. It's just like, oh, we need this new Salesforce report. I've got to go do that. That's one. Right. The second is, and this kind of goes in with the first, right? They're unclear on the goal. Mm-hmm. What are we trying to accomplish? What is the role of bringing a person or people in? What is the role? We're going to buy a tool. Why? What does success look like from that tool? We're going to do a training. We're going to hire an outsourced agency, any of those things. Again, business first. Why? What's the business value? How are we going to track that works or doesn't work? Right? With tools, and I love picking on buying tools because the salespeople are easy marks and there's a lot of great sales tech out there. But like, if you buy a tool, have a decision tree that you go through, a decision matrix that you use to do it, and what outcome metrics you expect to see happen. And then when your renewal is up, look to see how you did against those. Okay. And if you didn't achieve those, you might not be getting the value from the tool. Mm-hmm. The last piece is, depending on where you roll up in the organization, if you're a RevOps leader and you report to a chief revenue officer, if you're a RevOps leader and you report to customer success, if you report to the COO, that's going to influence how your day runs. But it's remembering revenue operations, not sales ops, not customer success ops, not marketing ops, not fin ops, not biz ops, revenue operations. You have an important role to play in the architecture of the revenue system and the revenue engine for a company. It's not just sales or just marketing or just customer success. It's all of those. And revenue operations leaders start somewhere. And many of them start in sales ops or marketing ops or CS ops. And it's tough to shake that. But it's like you need to think holistically about that. Those are the areas where I see folks stumble maybe out of the gate as they're scaling or as they're getting started in the discipline.
Very interesting, and I think I love the part as a salesperson. I think I'll just pick up the point on I think going back and delivering on the ROI part of it, right? And then while we can't define the ROI of RevOps, but we as salespeople, I think it's important, right? I think it's important to put up the processes, tools, everything in place to kind of make sure that and then align with the common goals for the organization to be successful and for the RevOps to kind of look at what are the key objectives that sort of picking up, right? And then depending on, as you said, right, they're not sales or they're not customer success ops, right? How do we look at a holistic view around that, right? So the great points, and I think we're sort of coming towards the end of a very, very interesting session, Richard. Really appreciate you taking our time today. I think there's a lot to unpack, there's a lot to learn, imbibe, and sort of put into practice for RevOps leaders who are kind of joining us. And thank you once again, Richard, for the conversation.
Of course. And thank you for having me. And hopefully folks found this helpful, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.
All right. Perfect. Have a good one, Richard. Thanks everybody for joining us today.
Take care, everyone.